The morning sun beat down on the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the wooden buildings that lined both sides of the road. It was Saturday, and that meant auction day. People from miles around had come to town, their wagons loaded with goods to sell or enough coins in their pockets to buy what they needed. The town square buzzed with activity. Farmers examined plows and harnesses. Women fingered bolts of fabric and tested the weight of cast-iron pots. Children ran between the legs of adults, their excited voices mixing with the sounds of horses stamping and chickens clucking in their wooden crates. But today's auction had something different, something that made decent folk shift uncomfortably and look away. At the far end of the wooden platform stood 5 children, huddled together like scared rabbits. The oldest was a girl of about 12, her brown hair pulled back in a simple braid. She wore a faded blue dress that had been patched and mended many times. Her small hands gripped tightly to a boy who couldn't have been more than 7. His dark eyes darted around the crowd, but he never made a sound. Next to them stood twin girls, maybe 9 years old, and a boy of 10 whose clothes hung loose on his thin frame. These were the orphans from the county home. With no family to claim them and no money to keep them fed, the county had decided to auction them off for work contracts. 5 years of labor in exchange for food and shelter. It was legal, they said. It was necessary, they claimed. Lily held her little brother Ben's hand so tight her knuckles had turned white. She could feel him trembling, though whether from fear or the cool morning air she couldn't tell. Around them the twins Rose and Ruby pressed close, their faces pale and drawn. The older boy, Peter, tried to look brave, but Lily could see the worry in his eyes. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice that carried across the square, banged his wooden hammer on the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now move to the work contracts for these fine young people. Strong backs, willing workers, and contracts binding for 5 full years." Lily's stomach twisted into knots. She'd heard stories about the work contracts. Some children went to farms where they were treated well, almost like family. Others weren't so lucky. They ended up in factories or mills where the work was dangerous and the food was scarce. The worst part was that once you were sold, there was no going back. 5 years felt like forever when you were 12 years old. "We'll start with the boy," the auctioneer announced, pointing at Peter. "Strong lad, good for farm work or mill operations. Do I hear opening bids?" A few hands went up around the crowd. Peter's jaw tightened as people called out numbers like he was no different from the livestock that had been sold earlier. After a few minutes of bidding, a farmer from outside town won the contract. Peter would be working in wheat fields, which was better than some alternatives. The twins went next, sold together to a woman who ran a boarding house. She looked kind enough, with gentle eyes and a soft voice when she spoke to the girls. Lily felt a small flutter of hope. Maybe things would work out for Rose and Ruby. Then it was Ben's turn. Lily's heart started pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Her little brother hadn't spoken a word since their parents died in the fever outbreak 6 months ago. He was small for his age and still had nightmares that left him crying in the dark. This young fellow might not look like much, but he's got nimble fingers, the auctioneer said, his voice taking on the practiced tone of a salesman, perfect for detail work and textile operations. Several hands shot up. Lily watched in horror as mill owners and factory supervisors began bidding on her brother. These weren't farmers looking for help with crops. These were men who ran operations where children worked long hours in dangerous conditions. The bidding grew intense. A mill owner with cold gray eyes kept raising his hand, driving the price higher and higher. Lily knew about him by reputation. Children who worked for him came back to town on market days looking thin and tired, their hands stained with dyes and their eyes empty. When the hammer finally fell, Ben had been sold to the gray-eyed man for the highest price of the day. The mill owner smiled with satisfaction, already calculating how much profit he could make from small hands working his machines. Lily felt like she couldn't breathe. In just a few minutes it would be her turn, and Ben would be taken away. She might never see him again. The thought made her legs feel weak and her vision blur around the edges. "And now for our final contract," the auctioneer announced. "This young lady has been helping around the county home for months. She can cook, clean, and manage household tasks. Perfect for a family in need of domestic help." The bidding started slowly. A few families looked interested, and Lily allowed herself to hope that maybe she'd end up somewhere decent. But then the same mill owner who had bought Ben raised his hand. "I'll take both contracts," he called out in a voice that silenced the square. The boy and the girl? They can work together in my operation. The auctioneer looked surprised but pleased. Well, now that's generous of you, Mr. Hawthorne. The current bid for the girl is— I'll double it, Hawthorne interrupted. For both of them. Lily's hope crumbled into dust. She'd heard terrible stories about Hawthorne's mill. Children who worked there sometimes had accidents with the machinery. Some developed coughs that never went away from breathing in cotton dust all day. Others simply disappeared, sent away when they became too sick or too old to be useful. The crowd murmured with surprise at the generous offer, but no one seemed willing to match it. Why would they? Hawthorne was offering more money than anyone expected to pay for child workers. Going once, the auctioneer called, raising his hammer. Lily squeezed Ben's hand and whispered, Whatever happens, stay close to me. I'll take care of you. Going twice. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine their parents. Maybe they were watching somehow. Maybe they'd understand that she'd tried her best to keep Ben safe. The hammer started to fall. Hands off, the voice exploded across the square like thunder, so loud and fierce that several people jumped. Horses snorted and shied. Children started crying. The entire crowd turned to see where the sound had come from. At the back of the gathering stood a man unlike anyone Lily had ever seen. He was massive, easily the tallest person in the square, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun behind him. His hair was dark brown streaked with gray, hanging long around a face weathered by years of mountain weather. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes were the pale blue of winter ice. He wore buckskin clothes and a coat made from bear fur that made him look even bigger than he already was. A rifle hung across his back, and a knife the size of Lily's forearm was strapped to his belt. Everything about him spoke of danger and wildness, as if a piece of the untamed mountains had walked into their civilized town. The crowd parted as he strode forward, his heavy boots drumming against the wooden planks of the platform. People scrambled to get out of his way. Even the auctioneer took a step back, his face going pale. Lily had heard stories about mountain men, the solitary trappers and hunters who lived in the high country. They were said to be more animal than human, dangerous and unpredictable. But as this giant of a man approached the platform, she saw something in his ice-blue eyes that surprised her. Anger, yes, but not the wild rage she expected. This was controlled fury, the kind that came from seeing something deeply wrong. He stopped directly in front of the platform, his gaze moving from the auctioneer to Hawthorne and back again. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than his initial roar, but it carried just as much weight. You're selling children like livestock, he said, and though his words were simple, they hit the crowd like physical blows. Human beings. Kids who should be playing and learning and living, not working themselves to death in some mill. Hawthorne stepped forward, his face red with indignation. Now see here, mountain man. This is all perfectly legal. These children need homes and work. I'm providing both. The giant's eyes fixed on Hawthorne with such intensity that the mill owner actually took a step back. Legal doesn't make it right. And we both know what kind of home you're offering. The contracts have been sold fair and square, the auctioneer protested, though his voice shook slightly. The bidding is closed. Without warning, the mountain man reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He hefted it in one massive hand, and even from the platform, Lily could hear the distinctive sound of gold coins clinking together. Here's your money, he said, tossing the pouch onto the platform where it landed with a heavy thud. That's enough gold to buy out every contract here twice over. Consider them all purchased. The auctioneer's eyes went wide as he opened the pouch and saw the glittering contents. There was more gold there than the entire auction would have raised, including the livestock and equipment. But Hawthorne wasn't giving up so easily. You can't just waltz in here and disrupt legal proceedings. I have rights as the winning bidder. The mountain man turned his full attention to Hawthorne, and the temperature in the square seemed to drop 10 degrees. And these children have rights too, rights you seem happy to ignore. He stepped closer to Hawthorne, his size advantage becoming even more apparent. The mill owner was average height and build, making him look almost childlike next to the towering giant. The wagon sat at the edge of town, a sturdy vehicle built for mountain travel. Its wooden sides were reinforced with iron bands, and the wheels looked strong enough to handle rocky terrain. 2 powerful horses stood in the traces, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. These weren't the typical farm horses most people in Cedar Ridge knew. These animals looked like they could climb mountains and ford rushing streams without breaking stride. Jonas helped each child into the back of the wagon, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted them up. The wagon bed was filled with supplies, sacks of flour and beans, blankets, tools, and other necessities for mountain living. There was even a small space that had been cleared, as if Jonas had planned for passengers. Lily settled herself near the front of the wagon where she could watch Jonas and keep an eye on the road behind them. Ben curled up next to her, his small body finally relaxing for the first time all day. The twins huddled together under one of the blankets, whispering quietly to each other. Peter sat straight and alert, trying to look brave despite everything that had happened. As Jonas climbed onto the driver's seat and picked up the reins, Lily heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Her stomach clenched with worry. Were they coming back for them already? 3 men on horseback rode toward the wagon, their faces grim and determined. In the lead was Sheriff Crawford, a thin man with a sparse mustache and eyes that never seemed to look directly at anyone. Behind him rode Hawthorne, the mill owner, his face red with anger. The third man Lily didn't recognize, but his badge and official bearing marked him as some kind of law enforcement. Jonas didn't seem surprised to see them. He wrapped the reins around his hands and waited calmly as the 3 riders approached. His casual posture didn't fool anyone, though. Lily could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes tracked each man's movements. Sheriff Crawford pulled his horse to a stop just a few feet from the wagon. "Jonas McKinnon," he called out in an official tone that sounded rehearsed. "I'm placing you under arrest for disrupting legal proceedings and kidnapping." Jonas didn't move from his seat. "Is that so, Crawford? And which law exactly did I break?" "You interfered with a legal auction," Hawthorne shouted from behind the sheriff. "Those children were legally sold and you had no right to take them." The third man, who wore a federal marshal's badge, spoke up. "I'm Marshal Thompson. Mr. Hawthorne has filed complaints about your actions today. The children need to be returned to their proper legal guardians." Jonas finally turned to look at the marshal, his ice-blue eyes steady and unblinking. "Proper legal guardians? You mean the man who was planning to work them to death in his mill?" "What I do with my property is my business," Hawthorne snapped. The words hit Jonas like a physical blow. His entire body went rigid, and when he spoke, his voice was so low and dangerous that even the horses seemed to sense the threat. "Property?" Jonas repeated slowly. "Did you just call children property?" Marshal Thompson held up a hand, clearly trying to prevent the situation from escalating further. "Now let's all stay calm here. The law is the law, and these contracts were signed legally." "Legal doesn't make it right," Jonas said, echoing his earlier words. "And I paid more than enough to cover those contracts." Sheriff Crawford pulled his gun, though his hand shook slightly as he pointed it at Jonas. "Legal or not, you're coming with us. And those children are going back where they belong." Lily felt Ben press closer to her side. The twins had gone completely silent, their eyes wide with fear. Peter's hands clenched into fists, though what a 10-year-old boy could do against armed men was unclear. Jonas looked at the gun pointed at him and smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. It was the kind of smile a wolf might wear just before it attacked. "Crawford," he said conversationally, "do you remember what happened to the Morrison gang when they tried to rob the mountain settlements last winter?" The sheriff's face went pale. Everyone in the territory had heard that story. The Morrison gang had been 6 experienced outlaws who thought the isolated mountain communities would be easy targets. They'd ridden up into the high country in December and never rode back down. When spring came, trappers found what was left of them scattered across 50 miles of wilderness. "That was you?" Marshal Thompson asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his own weapon. "Mountain justice," Jonas replied simply. "Some problems can't be solved with badges in courtrooms." Hawthorne's horse pranced nervously, sensing its rider's growing agitation. "You can't threaten federal law enforcement. That's a hanging offense." Jonas turned his full attention to Hawthorne, and the mill owner actually flinched. "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just pointing out that some of us have different ideas about justice than others." He gestured toward the children in his wagon. "You see property to be used and discarded. I see human beings who deserve a chance at life. What gives you the right to decide their fate?" Marshal Thompson demanded. For the first time since the confrontation began, Jonas's expression changed. The cold anger was replaced by something deeper, a pain so raw that even his enemies could see it. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," he said quietly. I know what it's like to watch the people you care about suffer and die while good legal men stand by and do nothing. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. My wife and daughter were killed in an Indian raid 5 years ago. The cavalry was supposed to protect the settlements, but they were too busy with official business to respond to our calls for help. Legal duty, they said. Proper procedures. Lily felt tears prick her eyes. The pain in Jonas's voice was unmistakable, and suddenly his actions made perfect sense. He wasn't just saving them from a bad situation. He was trying to prevent other children from suffering the way his own daughter had suffered. When the raid was over, Jonas continued, the cavalry arrived just in time to count the bodies and file their reports. Very legal, very proper, and completely useless to the people who died. Sheriff Crawford's gun hand had started to tremble. That's a terrible tragedy, but it doesn't give you the right to break the law. Jonas's laugh was bitter and cold. The law. The same law that says children can be sold to the highest bidder. The same law that protects men like Hawthorne while innocent people suffer. He stood up on the wagon seat, his full height making him even more imposing. I've lived in these mountains for 5 years now, Crawford. I know every trail, every cave, every hidden valley. If you think you can track me down and take these children back to that mill, you're welcome to try. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a forest fire. Everyone understood what Jonas was saying. He wasn't just offering to fight. He was promising a war that the law couldn't win. Marshal Thompson clearly understood the situation better than the local men. He'd dealt with mountain folk before and knew their reputation for fierce independence and survival skills. Perhaps we can work out some kind of arrangement, he said carefully, if proper guardianship papers could be filed. There's no arrangement to be made, Hawthorne interrupted. I paid good money for those contracts and I want what I bought. Jonas stepped down from the wagon, his movement fluid and dangerous. He was still 20 feet away from Hawthorne, but the mill owner's horse began backing away as if sensing a predator approaching. Tell me, Hawthorne, Jonas said conversationally as he walked closer. How many children have died in your mill over the past 5 years? I don't keep track of. Accidents happen in any business, Hawthorne stammered. Accidents, Jonas repeated. Is that what you call it when a 12-year-old girl gets her hair caught in machinery because she's too tired to be careful? Is that what you call it when children develop lung sickness from breathing cotton dust all day? With each question, Jonas took another step closer. Sheriff Crawford kept his gun trained on the mountain man, but his aim was wavering badly. I've heard the stories, Hawthorne. I know about the children who come to work for you healthy and strong, then disappear when they become too sick or too injured to be profitable. Hawthorne was now visibly sweating despite the cool mountain air. You can't prove any of that. There are no records. Of course there are no records, Jonas cut him off. Dead children don't file complaints. The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Even Marshal Thompson looked disturbed by the implications of what Jonas was saying. That's enough, the marshal said firmly. Mr. Hawthorne, I think it would be best if you return to town while I sort this situation out. I'm not leaving without my property, Hawthorne insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. He was clearly more afraid of Jonas than he was angry about losing the children. Jonas had stopped walking now, standing just 10 feet away from the mounted men. At this distance, Lily could see every detail of his weathered face, every scar that spoke of a hard life in dangerous country. Here's what's going to happen, he said in a voice that brooked no argument. Hawthorne is going to take his money and leave. The marshal is going to ride back to wherever he came from and forget he ever saw this wagon. And Crawford is going to go back to town and find something better to do with his time. And if we refuse? Sheriff Crawford asked, though his gun was now pointing at the ground. Jonas smiled that cold, dangerous smile again. The journey into the mountains took 3 days, and with each mile they climbed higher. The world below seemed to fall away like a bad dream. The air grew thinner and cooler, scented with pine and wildflowers that grew in patches of sunlight between the towering trees. Eagles soared overhead, their cries echoing off the rocky peaks that surrounded them on all sides. Jonas's cabin sat in a clearing halfway up one of the smaller mountains, positioned to catch the morning sun, but sheltered from the worst of the winter winds by a stand of enormous pine trees. It was bigger than Lily had expected, built from logs that must have taken years to cut and fit together. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and a small garden plot showed signs of recent planting. The cabin had 2 main rooms downstairs, and a loft above that could be reached by a sturdy wooden ladder. Outside, a stream ran clear and cold just 50 yards from the front door, and beyond that a pasture held several horses and a milk cow that looked up curiously as the wagon approached. "It's beautiful," Lily breathed as Jonas helped them down from the wagon. He looked around his property as if seeing it through fresh eyes. "It's peaceful," he said simply. "Sometimes that's enough." The first few days were awkward for everyone. Jonas was clearly not used to having people around, especially children. He moved through his daily routines with the quiet efficiency of someone who had lived alone for years, speaking only when necessary, and often forgetting that others might need explanations for what he was doing. The children, for their part, were still getting used to the idea that they were safe. They moved carefully around the cabin, afraid to touch anything or make too much noise. Ben hadn't spoken a word since leaving town, though he followed Jonas everywhere with wide, curious eyes. Lily found herself becoming the bridge between Jonas and the younger children. She helped organize sleeping arrangements in the loft, divided up the household chores, and translated Jonas's sometimes gruff instructions into words the others could understand. "He's not mean," she explained to the twins after Jonas had snapped at them for leaving the cabin door open. "He's just not used to having people around. We need to learn his ways." Slowly, carefully, they began to settle into a routine. Jonas woke before dawn each day to tend to the animals and check his trap lines. The children learned to start the fire and prepare breakfast while he was gone. When he returned, they would eat together in companionable silence, watching the sun rise over the mountain peaks. After breakfast, the real education began. Jonas had strong opinions about what children needed to know to survive in the mountains, and he wasn't shy about sharing his knowledge. "Forget whatever you learned in town schools," he told them on their first full day. "Up here, the mountains will teach you everything you need to know. But you have to pay attention, because the mountains don't give second chances to fools." He started with the basics: how to read the weather by watching cloud formations and feeling changes in air pressure, how to identify which plants were safe to eat and which ones would make you sick, how to track animals by their footprints and droppings, how to build a fire that would burn all night, and how to find shelter if you got caught in a storm. The children absorbed every lesson eagerly. Peter proved to have a natural talent for tracking, able to spot signs that even Jonas sometimes missed. The twins, Rose and Ruby, showed an impressive ability to remember which plants were useful for food or medicine. And Ben, though still silent, demonstrated an uncanny understanding of animal behavior that amazed everyone. But it was Lily who surprised Jonas the most. She had a fierce determination to master every skill he taught, as if she was trying to prove that she belonged in this wild place. She learned to use a rifle, handle a knife, set snares for small game, and navigate by the stars. More than that, she showed a natural leadership ability that helped keep the younger children organized and motivated. "You've got mountain sense," Jonas told her one evening as they sat on the cabin's front porch, watching the sun set behind the peaks. "Not everyone can learn that. It's something you're born with." Lily felt a warm glow of pride at his words. In town, she'd been just another orphan girl with no prospects and no future. Here in the mountains, she was becoming someone capable and strong. As the weeks passed, Jonas began to relax around the children. He started telling stories in the evenings, tales of his years as a trapper and scout, of dangerous encounters with wild animals and harsh winters that tested every survival skill he possessed. The children listened with rapt attention, hanging on every word. It was during one of these storytelling sessions that Ben finally spoke. Jonas was describing a winter when he'd been trapped in a cave for 3 days by a blizzard, surviving on nothing but jerky and melted snow. As he talked about the wolves that had sheltered in the cave with him, Ben suddenly piped up. "Did the wolves talk to you?" The question was so unexpected that everyone turned to stare at the little boy. He looked surprised by his own voice, as if he hadn't meant to speak out loud. Jonas considered the question seriously. "Not with words," he said finally, "but we understood each other well enough. They knew I wasn't a threat, and I knew they were just trying to survive the storm, same as me." From that moment on, Ben began talking more and more. At first it was just questions about animals and plants, but gradually he opened up about other things. Memories of his parents, fears about the future, and dreams about what he wanted to do when he grew up. The change in Ben seemed to unlock something in all of them. The cabin that had once felt too quiet now rang with laughter and conversation. The children began to truly behave like children again, playing games and pulling harmless pranks on each other. Even Jonas seemed lighter, as if the presence of young voices and laughter had filled some empty space in his heart that he'd forgotten existed. One day in late autumn, their peaceful routine was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Lily was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Her heart immediately started racing. Were the townspeople coming back for them? But when she ran around to the front of the cabin, she saw a single rider approaching slowly, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. It was an old Native American man, his gray hair braided with colorful beads and his face lined with years of mountain living. Jonas emerged from the cabin, but instead of reaching for his rifle, he smiled broadly and called out a greeting in a language Lily didn't recognize. The old man responded in the same tongue, and soon the two were clasping hands like old friends. "Children," Jonas called, "I want you to meet Joseph Crowfeather. He's one of the wisest men in these mountains, and an old friend of mine." Joseph was invited to stay for dinner, and over a meal of venison stew and fresh bread, he shared stories that made even Jonas's adventures seem tame. He told of vision quests in the highest peaks, of communicating with spirits that lived in the mountain streams, and of ancient wisdom passed down through generations of his people. "The mountains choose their own," Joseph said, looking at each of the children in turn. "Not everyone who comes here is meant to stay. But you 5, you have the look of those who belong." After dinner, Joseph pulled Lily aside for a private conversation. "The mountain man has a good heart," he said quietly, "but it has been broken for many years. You children are healing something in him that he thought was lost forever." Lily looked through the cabin window where Jonas was helping Ben learn to carve a small wooden horse. "He saved us," she said simply. Joseph nodded. "And you are saving him." The mountains have a way of bringing together those who need each other most. As autumn turned to winter, their mountain family grew closer and stronger. Jonas taught them to hunt larger game, to preserve meat for the cold months, and to read the signs that warned of approaching storms. The children learned to work as a team, each contributing their unique skills to their survival. When the first snow fell thick and soft and silent, Lily stood at the cabin window and marveled at how different her life had become. 6 months ago, she'd been a frightened girl facing a future of factory work and servitude. Now she was part of a family that lived by their own rules in one of the most beautiful places on earth. Ben appeared at her elbow, now chattering constantly about everything that interested him. "Lily, Jonas says he's going to teach us to track deer in the snow tomorrow. Do you think we'll see any?" She ruffled his hair affectionately. "I think we'll see whatever the mountains want us to see." Outside, Jonas was splitting firewood with smooth, powerful strokes. Peter and the twins were building a snow fort, their laughter carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Everything felt right and good and permanent, but Lily had learned not to take peace for granted. Somewhere deep in her mind, she wondered how long their happiness could last. The outside world had a way of intruding on even the most perfect hiding places. For now, though, she was content to watch the snow fall and listen to her brother's excited chatter about tomorrow's adventure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. The mountain man who had roared his defiance at injustice had become something none of them had expected: a father. And the frightened orphans he'd rescued had become his children in every way that mattered. Spring came late to the high country that year, with snow lingering in the shaded valleys well into May. But when it finally arrived, it brought more than just wildflowers and singing birds. It brought trouble riding up the mountain trail on horseback. Lily spotted them first from her perch in the tall pine tree where she'd been checking a hawk's nest. 3 riders moving slowly up the winding path that led to their cabin, picking their way carefully around fallen logs and rocky outcrops. Even from a distance, she could tell these weren't friendly visitors. Their movements were too purposeful, too determined. She scrambled down from the tree as quickly as safety allowed and ran toward the cabin where Jonas was teaching Ben how to repair a broken axe handle. The other children were scattered around the clearing, each busy with their assigned morning tasks. "Jonas," she called out breathlessly. Riders coming up the trail. 3 of them. His head snapped up immediately and she saw his entire body tense like a coiled spring. "How far out?" "Maybe 20 minutes at the pace they're moving." Jonas set down the axe and moved with swift efficiency. "Everyone inside. Now, Peter, get the rifles from the gun rack. Twins, pack the emergency packs. Ben, help them. Lily, come with me." They'd practiced this routine many times over the winter, preparing for the possibility that someone might come looking for them. Jonas had hoped it would never be necessary, but he'd lived too long in dangerous country to ignore the possibility. As the other children rushed to follow his instructions, Jonas led Lily to the front window where he kept a small telescope. He extended it to its full length and studied the approaching riders carefully. "Sheriff Crawford," he said grimly. "And that Federal Marshal Thompson. The third one I don't recognize, but he's wearing a badge too." Lily felt her stomach drop. "Are they coming to take us back?" "They're sure going to try." Jonas collapsed the telescope and turned to face her. "Listen carefully, Lily. If this goes bad, you take the others and use the escape route we practiced. Head for Joseph Crowfeather's village. He'll keep you safe until I can sort this out." "We're not leaving you," Lily said firmly. Jonas placed a large, gentle hand on her shoulder. "You might have to. I need to know that you'll take care of the others if something happens to me." Before Lily could argue further, the sound of approaching horses grew loud enough for everyone to hear. Jonas checked his rifle one more time and then stepped out onto the cabin's front porch. Lily positioned herself just inside the doorway where she could see and hear everything, but remain mostly hidden. The three riders approached slowly, their hands visible, but resting on their weapons. Sheriff Crawford looked nervous, constantly glancing around as if expecting an ambush. Marshal Thompson appeared more confident, but even he seemed uncomfortable in the mountain setting. The third man was younger, maybe in his 30s, with the hard look of someone used to enforcing the law through violence. They stopped about 30 feet from the cabin, close enough to talk but far enough away to draw weapons if necessary. "Jonas McKinnon," Marshal Thompson called out formally. "We need to talk." "Talk away," Jonas replied, not moving from his position on the porch. "Beautiful morning for conversation," the younger lawman spoke up. "I'm Deputy Marshal Williams. We're here on official business regarding the unlawful removal of minor children from legal custody." Jonas's expression didn't change. "Those children came with me voluntarily. No crime in that." "Actually, there is," Williams continued. "New federal legislation has clarified the legal status of orphaned minors. They cannot simply choose their own guardians without proper legal procedures." Lily felt her heart sink. This sounded more serious than their previous encounter with the law. "What kind of legal procedures?" Jonas asked carefully. Marshal Thompson pulled out a folded document. "Court hearings, background investigations, financial assessments. The children need to be returned to proper authorities while these procedures are completed." "And how long would that take?" "Could be several months," Williams said with a shrug. "Maybe longer if there are complications." Lily saw Jonas's jaw clench. Several months back in the county home or worse, sent to families who might not treat them well. Several months of uncertainty and fear while bureaucrats decided their fate. During which time they'd be housed where exactly? Jonas asked. Sheriff Crawford finally found his voice. "The county has arrangements with several families and institutions that can provide temporary care. Hawthorne's Mill being one of them, I suppose." The silence that followed was answer enough. The mill owner still had connections, still had influence with the local authorities. "The law is the law, McKinnon," Williams said impatiently. "These children are coming with us today. You can make this easy or hard, but the result will be the same." Jonas stepped down from the porch, his movement casual but somehow threatening. "Actually, Deputy Marshal Williams, I think you'll find the result depends entirely on how much you want these children and how much you're willing to sacrifice to get them." "Are you threatening federal officers?" Williams demanded, his hand moving toward his gun. "I'm explaining the facts of mountain life," Jonas replied calmly. "You rode up here with 3 men and whatever supplies you could carry on horseback. I've been living in these mountains for 5 years. I know every trail, every cave, every source of water for 50 miles in any direction." He gestured toward the towering peaks that surrounded them. "You think you can track me and 5 children through terrain that's killed experienced hunters and trappers? You think you can survive up here long enough to catch us when we don't want to be caught?" Marshal Thompson held up a hand, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Now let's not turn this into something it doesn't need to be. We're all reasonable men here." "Reasonable?" Jonas's voice carried a sharp edge. "You call it reasonable to drag children away from a safe, happy home to put them back into a system that treats them like property?" Deputy Williams was growing visibly angry. "That's not your decision to make. The law exists for a reason. And what reason is that?" Jonas shot back. "To protect children, or to protect the profits of men like Hawthorne?" To maintain order and proper procedures, Williams replied stiffly. Jonas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Order. That's what they said when the cavalry was too busy with proper procedures to respond to Indian raids. That's what they said when good people died because following regulations was more important than saving lives. From her position in the doorway, Lily could see the conflict playing out on Marshal Thompson's face. He was clearly uncomfortable with the situation but bound by his duty to enforce the law. "Look, McKinnon," Thompson said quietly, "I can see that the children are well cared for here, but the law has changed, and we have to follow proper procedures. If you truly care about these kids, you'll help us make this transition as smooth as possible." "Transition to what?" Jonas demanded. "A life of factory work and servitude. A future where they're bought and sold like livestock? The guardianship process will ensure they're placed in appropriate homes," Thompson insisted. "Appropriate according to who? Bureaucrats who've never met them? Politicians who see them as problems to be solved, rather than human beings with their own wishes and feelings." The argument might have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected interruption. Ben came running out of the cabin, tears streaming down his face. "Please don't take us away," he cried, throwing his arms around Jonas's leg. "We want to stay here. This is our home." The other children followed, despite Jonas's earlier instructions to stay inside. Peter moved to stand beside Jonas, trying to look older and more mature than his years. The twins clung to each other, their eyes wide with fear. "You see?" Jonas said quietly, placing a protective hand on Ben's head. "They've already made their choice. What gives you the right to override it?" Deputy Williams looked unmoved by the emotional display. "Children don't have the legal capacity to make such decisions. That's why we have guardianship laws." But Marshal Thompson was clearly affected by what he was seeing. These weren't neglected or abused children. They were healthy, well-dressed, and obviously loved. The cabin behind them was clean and well-maintained, and the mountain setting provided them with educational opportunities they'd never find in town. "Perhaps," Thompson said slowly, "there might be a way to handle this situation that serves everyone's interests." Williams turned to stare at his superior. "Marshal, our orders are clear. The children are to be returned for proper placement." "Our orders are to ensure the children's welfare," Thompson corrected. "If they're already in a situation that serves their welfare, perhaps we need to consider alternatives." Jonas sensed an opening and pressed his advantage. "What would it take to make this legal? What procedures would need to be followed?" Thompson considered carefully before answering. "Formal guardianship papers, financial documentation showing you can provide for them, character references, a home inspection by child welfare authorities." "And if I could provide all of that, then the children could potentially remain in your custody while the formal process is completed." Deputy Williams looked furious. "This is highly irregular. Our instructions were to return the children immediately." The 2 weeks that followed were the most intense of Lily's young life. Jonas threw himself into the task of gathering the required documentation with the same focused determination he'd once used to survive mountain winters and dangerous wildlife encounters. The biggest challenge was getting character references from people the authorities would consider credible. Jonas had lived as a hermit for 5 years, avoiding contact with civilized society as much as possible. Most of his friends were fellow mountain men, trappers, and Native Americans whose word wouldn't carry much weight in a court of law. But Jonas was more resourceful than the children had realized. On the 3rd day after the marshal's visit, he saddled his horse and rode down to the town of Pine Ridge, 30 miles south of Cedar Ridge. It was a longer journey, but Pine Ridge had a different sheriff and different politics. While Jonas was gone, Lily found herself in charge of keeping everyone's spirits up. Ben had started having nightmares again, waking up crying about being taken away from their mountain home. The twins had become clingy and nervous, jumping at every unexpected sound. Even Peter, usually the most mature of the group, showed signs of strain. "What if the paperwork isn't enough?" Rose asked one evening as they sat around the fire. "What if they decide to take us anyway?" Lily had been wondering the same thing, but she tried to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Jonas won't let that happen, and if they try to take us, we'll use the escape routes we practiced. Joseph Crowfeather will help us." "But then we'd be fugitives," Ruby pointed out. "We could never come back home." The word home hung in the air between them. This cabin, these mountains, this life they'd built together, it had become home in a way that none of them had expected. The thought of losing it was almost unbearable. Jonas returned on the 5th day, with a leather satchel full of documents and a grim expression that didn't hide a spark of hope in his eyes. I found some old friends in Pine Ridge, he explained as the children gathered around him eagerly. Men I served with during the war. They're respected citizens now, a banker, a judge, and a doctor. They were willing to vouch for my character. He pulled out several official-looking papers. I also managed to get financial documentation, showing I have enough money saved to support all of you. Turns out all those years of trapping and selling furs added up to more than I thought. Lily felt a flutter of hope. Is it enough? It's a start, but we need more. We need someone in a position of authority who can speak to how well you children are being cared for here. That someone turned out to be an unexpected ally. On the 7th day, Joseph Crow Feather arrived at their cabin with a stranger in tow. A woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple but well-made traveling dress. This is Dr. Margaret Stevens, Joseph explained as Jonas welcomed them both into the cabin. She works for the territorial government evaluating child welfare situations. She's also someone who understands that the law and justice don't always point in the same direction. Dr. Stevens spent 3 days at the cabin, observing the children's daily routines and talking with each of them privately. She watched Ben recite the names and habits of 24 different bird species. She saw Peter demonstrate his tracking skills by following a deer trail for over a mile. She listened as the twins explained the medicinal properties of various mountain plants. And she observed Lily organizing the household and helping Jonas plan their food supplies for the coming winter. These children are receiving an education here that no town school could provide, she told Jonas on her final evening. They're healthy, happy, and clearly loved. Any bureaucrat who tries to argue that they'd be better off in an institutional setting would have to answer to my report. On the 10th day, Jonas made one final trip down to Cedar Ridge to file all the paperwork with the territorial authorities. He took Lily with him, partly because her testimony might be needed, and partly because he wanted her to understand exactly what they were up against. The town hadn't changed much in the months since their dramatic departure. The same dusty streets, the same weathered buildings, the same people going about their daily business. But now Lily saw it all through different eyes. The buildings seemed small and cramped after the vast openness of the mountains. The air felt thick and stale compared to the crisp clarity of high altitude, and the people seemed pale and tired, as if they'd forgotten what it felt like to live under an open sky. At the territorial office, they met with a clerk who seemed surprised by the thoroughness of Jonas's documentation. This is quite impressive, Mr. McKinnon, the man said, leafing through the papers. Character references from respected citizens, financial statements, and a glowing report from Dr. Stevens. I don't think I've ever seen such complete guardianship documentation. The children's welfare is important to me, Jonas replied simply. The clerk stamped several forms and handed Jonas a receipt. Everything appears to be in order. Marshal Thompson has been notified that you've complied with all legal requirements. Unless someone files a formal objection within the next 3 days, the temporary guardianship will become permanent. As they prepared to leave town, Lily spotted a familiar figure across the street. Hawthorne stood outside his mill, watching them with obvious anger. His business had been struggling since word spread about his treatment of child workers, and seeing Jonas and Lily together clearly reminded him of opportunities lost. He's going to cause trouble, isn't he? Lily asked quietly. Jonas followed her gaze and nodded grimly. Men like Hawthorne don't give up easily, but now we have the law on our side instead of against us. They rode back to the mountains with a sense of cautious optimism. The paperwork was filed, the authorities seemed satisfied, and they had powerful allies backing their case. For the first time in weeks, Lily allowed herself to believe that their family might actually survive intact. But their celebration was premature. On the 13th day, Marshal Thompson arrived at their cabin with news that made everyone's heart sink. Hawthorne has filed a formal objection, he announced without preamble. He's claiming that you coerced the children into supporting you and that mountain life is inherently dangerous for minors. Jonas felt the familiar surge of anger, but he kept his voice level. On what evidence? He's brought in a doctor who claims that high-altitude living is harmful to developing children. And he's found a witness who says you threatened him with violence to force him to abandon his legal claim to the children. Both of those claims are ridiculous, Jonas said flatly. Maybe so, but they have to be answered in court. There's going to be a hearing in Cedar Ridge tomorrow morning. You and the children need to be there. Lily felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. After everything they'd been through, after all the paperwork and preparation, it was coming down to a courtroom battle against a man with money and influence. That evening, as they prepared for what might be their final night in their mountain home, Jonas gathered the children around the fire one last time. Tomorrow is going to be difficult, he said honestly. Hawthorne has money and connections, and he's not going to give up easily. But I want you all to remember something important. He looked at each of them in turn, his ice-blue eyes reflecting the firelight. You're not the same frightened children who stood on that auction platform almost a year ago. You've learned to be strong, to think for yourselves, to stand up for what you believe in. Whatever happens tomorrow, nobody can take that away from you. The hearing the next morning was held in the town's small courthouse, a building that had been packed beyond capacity with curious onlookers. Word of the mountain man's battle for his adopted children had spread throughout the territory, and people had come from miles around to witness the outcome. Judge Harrison, a fair-minded man in his 60s, called the court to order and explained the purpose of the hearing. This is not a criminal trial, he announced. We're here to determine what arrangement best serves the welfare of 5 minor children. Hawthorne's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of Jonas as a dangerous hermit who had kidnapped the children and brainwashed them into supporting him. He presented testimony from a doctor who claimed that mountain living was harmful to children's health and development. These children belong in civilization, the lawyer argued, where they can receive proper education and moral guidance, not in the wilderness with a man who has rejected all the values of decent society. When it was Jonas's turn to respond, he stood up slowly and faced the judge directly. Your Honor, he said in his deep, steady voice, I didn't come down from the mountains looking for children to adopt. I came down because I couldn't stand by and watch human beings being sold like livestock. He gestured toward the children, who sat in the front row of the courtroom. Look at them, Your Honor, really look at them. Do they appear neglected or harmed? Do they seem like children who have been coerced or threatened? Judge Harrison did look, and what he saw was 5 healthy, confident young people who watched the proceedings with intelligent interest rather than fear. The law exists to protect children, Jonas continued, not to punish them for making choices that don't fit conventional expectations. These children chose to come with me freely,